I wouldn't even say distraction anymore. It was almost like a religion. It was something that
Mhm.
was more important than life.
What is the new sense of purpose in your life after recovery?
I'm not going to lie, for me, and I can only talk as I find, there were good things to my anorexia. I can't talk for all eating disorders, I can't talk for everyone, but for me, I loved being anorexic. I adored being anorexic. And it's that feeling of you taking control of yourself. It's that feeling, food is such an important part of your life, and to deny yourself that swooping, soaring feeling of like, yes, I'm on top of this. When you felt waif in your body, when you felt lithe and thin, you felt childish again. A lot of anorexics use it, apparently, or any eating disorders for that matter, use it to cling on to their childhood. I went silly, I went ridiculous. Your endorphins are firing, your brain is fired, everything's going over the place, and it's absolutely beautiful. And I think we need to talk about this because it's the problem that we have with drugs education as well. It's the exact same thing. People just go like, you know, don't take heroin, kids. It's properly bad for you, isn't it? And they say like, oh, don't take cocaine. And I'm not saying kids should take heroin or cocaine, you know, that would be awful. What I am saying is, people that take heroin and cocaine, at the time, at the moment, blummin' love it. And that was incredible.
There we go. Got it, mate.
Yeah, I think everything works pretty good now. And so once again, how are you?
Good, thank you. Yeah, I'm working at. We've got some friends that we look after their dogs. So I'm working from the dog's house today, which is really lovely. So I've got them on my feet. So all good. How about you? What are you up to?
I'm really good actually. Thank you so much. And to be honest, just like it's the first time I'm conducting an interview both on Zoom but also in English. So I'm a little bit stressed to be honest, but
Yeah.
I'm yeah excited at the same time. And I'm glad. Yeah, let's see uh, how it goes. And I hope I can understand everything that you say. Like the videos I saw with you was like maybe 90% I understood. So I think everything should be okay. Yep.
That's pretty impressive. I mean, that's better than my language skills because they are terrible.
All right. Okay. So let's start. Once again, nice to have you here, Dave. And I want to conduct this like interview or a conversation, whatever you want to call, like a movie in a way that I want to start with a small detail from the present, and then we could go back to the past to understand your personal context a little bit better, and then maybe expand on everything based on that knowledge, if that makes sense. uh, and it will make more sense probably in a moment. So I want to ask you if that's okay. uh, could you share what you ate in the last 24 hours, like what actual food uh, did you eat? I hope
The
that
last
the
one,
question makes sense. And
oddly, I think in the last 24 hours, I was working really early yesterday, so I met up with one of my oldest mates from school, and we went to the pub and we had far too much to drink, and then ended up eating bar food. And then I came home much later than I thought and had some leftovers that were in the fridge and fell asleep. So, not really the kind of paradigm of like healthy eating, but yeah, that would be me.
so kind of chaotic, would you say? But at the same, like chaotic, nothing like like repeatable type of eating for you. And the second question I have to ask at the moment is how stressful or how natural were the food choices you were making? Like it seems very natural. It sounds like you didn't think much about it, and
Mm.
obviously you know where I'm going into. And so let's start with that. Was it like did you even think about like, oh, is it good for me, is it not good for me, and so on?
You know what? That is a great question because we were in Camden in North London and there were loads of like food vendors. And my friend that I was with, he doesn't have a sort of history of eating disorders, and he found it really quite overwhelming. Of like people were like shouting, like, "Do you want Chinese? Do you want Indian? Do you want Thai?" And it was like a bit overwhelming. And I did have a little thought of, I kind of just picked what I wanted and I went with that. So although it was something that kind of like registered in my mind as like, gosh, this is quite a fraught environment, it didn't take up loads of space in my brain, and it didn't become something that it caused me the anxiety that I think it certainly would have done 10, 15 years ago.
Absolutely, yeah. I was actually trying to count how many years, how old you are, and based on the numbers you gave in in your TED talk on in some other interviews that I saw, I suppose you are now 33, 34. Would you say?
Bang on, mate. Good maths. I'm 34, yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Okay, because your TED talk was 8 years old, and in that TED talk you say that your eating disorder history started like around 8 years back. So that's around, and you were 17 at that time. So I counted more or less. So at the could we go back to your childhood and when you were growing up, how normal were you as a kid? If that question is fine to ask, if you know what I mean.
I was incredibly fortunate because where I grew up, it was okay to not be normal. I had an
Okay.
amazing school. It was a very poor school. It was the most underfunded school in all of Staffordshire. But the people that I was at school with, they were brilliant. They were creative. They were stupid. They were fun. And I think I'd always really struggled to kind of find my own identity. So as I grew up, I went through different sort of styles. So when I was much younger, I was more bumbling and quite loud. And then as I started to mature a little bit, I became less loud but more sort of cheeky. And then as I got to sort of 16, 17, it kind of, with hormones kicking in and becoming more aware of girls, I became more aware of like how I was with other people, more aware of my body, and actually just generally, oddly, I think as I kind of grew up, I became less and less aware of who I was, which I realize sounds very um, flowery, but I'd always been into things like performing arts, doing acting at school and stuff like that, which I think in most schools would get you bullied to high hell. But actually at my school, it was great. Like we were okay, people were okay doing that. I think the general rule seemed to be if you could make people laugh, if you could have a joke with them, then you could get away with anything.
Yeah, nice. Well, I liked your description of. I mean, the reason you say why you were lucky, that it's not that you were normal, is that you were kind of not normal, but you were
Yeah.
accepted as being who you were at that time, and so that's nicely put. I really like that. But somehow your problems started with the symptoms were eating disorder, and how would you describe this part of your life, this context, how it started? It was, I know that it started when you were preparing to get the lead role in a play, but what other factors would you say influenced your behavior at that particular period of your life? You were 16, 17, I assume.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, in a word, at that age, I was conflicted because I loved where I lived. I loved my friends, I loved my family, I loved the village. Um, but I was very aware that that was all gonna erode and move and change in the next couple of years when I went away to university. And I was also very aware that in order to get to university, I'd have to work my ass off. And so I was really conflicted between, do I focus on the here and now and have fun and go partying with my mates, go to the pub with my friends, go clubbing, etc. All of these things that teenagers want to do I do all of those things to the detriment of my future self because my studies won't get as much time, I won't be able to revise for that research or put work into that coursework? So I was torn between, do I focus on the here and now, or do I cancel everything going on in my life at the moment, all of that enjoyment, and do I just write the essays? Do I just do the revision? Do I just focus on the future and forget about the present? So there was like loads of conflicting things. So I did lose weight for a play and people started congratulating me. I, as I lost weight, as people kept on congratulating me, it made sense in my mind that if people were saying, well done on losing weight, then putting on weight must be terrible. And I'd never really thought of it like that before. And I also got noticed by girls for the first time, and that was amazing. And I had also loads of experiences, like most teenagers, you know, your first boozy night out, your first try of a joint, your first try of a cigarette, all of these things. It was all fizzy and exciting. But it kind of felt unsustainable. And I was like, do I focus on the here and now or do I focus on the future? And the eating disorder behaviors snuck in through those gaps in life to give me something else to focus on, something else to kind of anchor myself down in. And it was a sort of, I wouldn't even say distraction anymore. It was almost like a religion. It was something that
Mhm.
was more important than life. Some
Yeah,
people went to church to pray to their God to ask them to get in, whereas I just focused on calories, exercising, weighing, and that was my thing.
sure. So when you say, because I was tempted to ask, what did you choose when you said that you were wondering like whether you should focus on here and now or maybe investing in your studies, in work. And would you agree with the statement that kind of addictive mechanisms of eating disorder chose for you? Because this,
Absolutely. And I think it made me, because I wasn't feeding my brain as much and I was getting massive mood swings and changes in behavior, it made me even more impulsive. I no longer focused on the long game stuff. I focused on what I was feeling then and now. So if I was feeling very studious, bam, I'd just go to the library and I'd just be in the library. Whereas if I was feeling, oh, sod it, I would go out to the pub at lunch. There wasn't actually, as the behaviors started to get more and more extreme, the consistency within my behavior started to get more and more unpredictable.
sure. So like it was like the eating disorder kind of connected the good of both words that you were kind of like thinking in between, that it gave you both the feeling of here and now. You felt extremely present, I suppose, uh, in your game, and at the same time it gave you a sense of purpose, right? um,
Yeah.
and this is where I want to like I want to ask you about, like, to maybe to expand on, even to say the same that you said in this Millstone documentary. And this is where I start, where I noticed you, and I just heard a few words you said, and I was like, yes, this is something that like people need to know, and this is right on point, and this is making a lot of sense to me when you said like, I even remember almost by heart when you say like, I'm not gonna lie, and for me it was extremely pleasurable. And people very often think black and white, that eating disorder is bad for you, and in some sense it's true, but in some sense also it's very good for you. It's like at the moment, it's like, what else do you need? You're extremely present, you feel sense of purpose, and it actually kind of resolves all your problems that you were experiencing just before involving in this activity, right?
I think it kind of, I wouldn't say it solves it. It certainly kicks the can down the hill, to use the kind of phrase. And I absolutely loved it. And I absolutely got addicted to it. And I absolutely started to think, this is me. This is what I do. This is who I am. I am the guy that runs home from school to weigh himself. I am the guy that knows how many calories are in every single thing. I am the guy that will always be dropping weight, that is obsessed with how much his size is. Um, and the problem is, when I first started losing weight, when people started saying to me, congratulations, and etc., it was an easy win. It was a nice excitement. And eating disorders are 100% not a diet gone wrong. But I also think the dieting culture kind of leans in on it a little bit of, as I started losing that weight, people were congratulating me. And as I started losing that weight, for example, I did get noticed by girls, and that was really fizzy. That was really exciting. And of course, everything was brilliant. Everything was incredible. And all of the stories that I'd read about eating disorders and generally mental illness at large were people who were down and out. They were at their lowest ebb. And that wasn't me. I loved this. This was, to be honest, the eating disorder almost made things feel more like a movie, which in a weird way made things more manageable because it's easier to live a character than it is to live a life. It's easier to pretend to be someone two-dimensional rather than three-dimensional. But the problem with that enjoyment was the wins, the enjoyments, the good bits of news, they came harder and harder to get. And over time, I will be honest that I did stop enjoying it. But by that point in time, the behaviors were so entrenched that I genuinely didn't feel like I had a choice to do it anymore. It was almost like being, let's say you're the person who is super organized. You know, sort of when you go on holiday, you've got your passport, you're printing out your boarding pass, you've got an itemized bill. That's fine, but there will become a point later on in your life where you don't have time to organize every single aspect in your life, and you're faced with this kind of identity crisis of, if I'm not doing that anymore, that was always who people knew that I was. That was always who I told people I was. So who am I anymore? So it just became something that I slept walked into. It became my explanation as a person. And the enjoyment really started to wane out. But I actually didn't realize, because at that point, when the enjoyment started to wane out, my brain really wasn't functioning properly at all.
Right. So at that point, your full identity was what you do. Like there was no distinguishment between who you are and what you do. And
Yeah.
yeah, would you say that that was the cause of the suffering in that time, or?
Oh, well, I mean, again, something that I rarely talk about because it really muddies the water is, I was very open, especially at school and to a lesser extent at university, that I was the anorexic. I hid in plain sight. I joked it off. I was like, well, this is the anorexic, isn't it? Yeah, I'm the anorexic guy. That's it.
I totally know the
And
feeling. It gave you even more attention, right? Yeah.
it that is the thing, and it's horrible. And I use the word attention very carefully, because underpinning that was a sort of lack of self-esteem, self-worth, self-identity. But yeah, it was my superpower. It
Mhm.
was my thing that I did. I wasn't good at football. I wasn't good at sports. I certainly wasn't academic. I didn't have any special skills. So the anorexia was my thing. And that also helps sustain it as well, because if anyone was thinner, lighter, better at exercising, better at calorie counting than me, I had to, and it's a horrible thing, beat that person
Sure.
because they just trod on my patch. And that's a very uncomfortable truth.
All right. And would you be able to share the turning point? where like things from going well started going bad, and how quickly you realized that? Was it you who realized that, or someone kind of directed you into realizing that?
It is a great question because I always try and avoid the Hollywoodized version of things because I think whenever I used to read these stories, mental health seems so obvious when written on a page, but when you're talking about it to someone like, in the moment, it's all kind of chaos and, you've got stuff going on. You're like, oh, I've got an Amazon delivery coming now, or I've got this going, there's so much stuff going on in life at the moment. People kept on telling me I was anorexic. People kept on taking me aside. My mom kept on crying and screaming and saying, like, you're anorexic. So other people certainly noticed for a long time. But I think I was perhaps unique in the sense that I actually did have a turning point where I realized that I needed to modify or change my behavior. And that came when I was teaching English as a foreign language down in these little private schools in England. So there are kids from all over the world that come to these private schools to improve their English. And they get students to kind of live with them. They all get boozed up. It's like a bit of a holiday break, but you're working at the same time, like Camp America. And I was working in one of them. And when I arrived, the teacher met me and she said, look, do you want to have something to eat? And I said, no. And then I went there at lunch and it was pizza, pasta, chips. There was no calorie count. There was no choice. There was nowhere to prepare your own food. The nearest shop was 3 miles away. And it was weird for me because I was amazed how much I freaked out because I started to avoid food as much as possible. But then, and again, a very uncomfortable truth, I started binging, very common for people with anorexia. And once I started eating, I genuinely couldn't stop. And I wasn't chewing things, I was just swallowing bread rolls whole and like things like this. And what's worse is this was in front of not only other teachers, other staff, but also my students as well. And they were like, the hell is Mr. Chawner doing? Look at him. And I was getting stuff all over my face. I was dropping stuff down. I was using my hands. And they're like, what the fuck is he doing? And that was mortifying. So then I started to try and sneak food into my room because I was like, I will binge, but at least if I do it in private, that's not as bad. But that led to a rat infestation, and people started asking, why have you, like, we've got unlimited food, mate, you don't need to worry about. And then I started setting my alarm in the middle of the night to start doing exercises. I genuinely honestly had started having nightmares about donuts. It was on my mind so much that even in my sleep I was dreaming that I was like eating this stuff and I'd eaten too much. And one of the teachers turned around and said, look, mate, I've been in therapy for bulimia 3 times. This is a really tricky environment. Had you ever thought you might have anorexia? And that was so pivotal to me because that was the first time anyone had asked me if I had an eating disorder rather than telling me. And even though that was a turning point, I started to acknowledge I do not have a good relationship with food. I certainly don't have a good relationship with my body. And acknowledging that in the moment for the first time, rather than sort of saying, oh, I was anorexic, or oh, I had anorexia, like actually saying, no, here and now, I'm really struggling with that, was a kind of cathartic thing. But I never did anything about it purely because anorexia to me was the extreme. It was you had to be in hospital, you had to be fainting, you had to be at the point of death. And I certainly wasn't that. And I didn't realize that mental illness in general is a spectrum in the same way that, health is on a spectrum. Sometimes you're feeling a little bit ill. I didn't think that you could have that with eating disorders. So I still didn't do anything about it, even though I knew I had a problem for a good 3, 4 years.
Right, sure. So when did you start doing something with it?
So then it really started to, I started to acknowledge it and play around with this idea of pushing myself. And this is the hardest bit to explain because the horrible truth of the matter is that it kind of faded in and out of my consciousness, kind of like background noise. So when I was happy, so I remember being at university and finals coming up and a lot of that stress. I remember being more obsessed with food. I wouldn't eat anything I hadn't cooked. I started restricting the things that I would eat more and more and more. And then when I moved to London and I got my first job and I was in a flat, everything was amazing. And I started, without even thinking, going to the canteen and buying a muffin, which, you know, 6 months previous would have been mind blowing to have that. And then I started putting on weight, and even one of the people said to me that were there, oh, she called me Mr. Shirt Stretch because she was like, you put on a little bit of weight. And when things were going okay, it was all right being Dave. I didn't need an escape route. So I actually was sort of okay with food. I still knew the calories. You can't unlearn something like that. But I'd push it. I'd have, you know, pasta and all of these things. But then when things became fraught, I got a horrible job in London and I got fired and it was all kind of, so when all of that started to happen, I started to go back to those practices of restricting, of exercising. So it kind of dipped in and out. And what essentially, to answer the question, drove me into treatment was that sort of 3.5 years later, I'd really exacerbated, I'd really accelerated, I was really unhappy. And I went to the doctors for depression because I was by this time constantly drinking, I was constantly unhappy, I was really aggressive, I was pushing people away. And I knew that it was a suicide attempt. And I went to the doctors and I said, look, I'm here for depression. I have anorexia. I can play the system. You can't do anything about it. And I refused treatment 4 times. And the only thing that made me go into treatment was that one of the nurses was really exacerbated. And she said, look, bottom line, you wouldn't expect your laptop to work if you don't charge it. Why are you expecting your brain to release the feel-good like chemicals if you aren't giving it the energy to do that? And honestly, I had to go away and honestly I had to think about recovery. And it genuinely hung in the balance because honestly, I'd been so convinced that I was going to kill myself with this. And that didn't scare me. Genuinely, the idea of living into my 30s, into my 40s, was more terrifying than the idea of dying. So I really had to think about it. And eventually I thought about it, and that's when I engaged in treatment.
Right. Thank you for sharing. And would you be able to say a little bit more about treatment? Was it like a regular therapy? How often? Or because this is something I was kind of curious about, but I didn't see anywhere. And is it because you don't want to disclose or?
The weird thing about, and I think you're absolutely right, the difficult thing about treatment and the tough thing that I have to try and explain that is I don't want to pretend it's all rainbows and sunshines. It was a really tough kind of process, and I think it is for a lot of people. So I was diagnosed and I was under the care of the Maudsley Hospital for about 2.5 years, and I had psychotherapy, which is basically talking therapies. And the best way that I can explain it is it was almost like having a personal trainer for your brain. So like you might go to the gym and you might initially love going to the gym, but then there's a tough part and then it kind of picks up again. It was exactly the same for my brain. There were times when I sort of cried in that room. I think I got more suicidal then when I was under that care than any other time. And it was 1 hour a week talking therapies, and it was a conversation that was guided by the psychotherapist. And what was really interesting about all of that was things that I had glossed over, things that I was very glib about, like, you know, saying even just little things of like, you know, let's talk about your relationship with your sexuality. I was like, oh, that's fine, like I'm straight, that's done. I don't think we're going to find anything there, so I want to move on. I think we've got to talk about And once you pick up all the little rocks, you find all of these kind of things underneath that you're like, oh God, I didn't realize that related to that. And I think I struggle to explain therapy because it really helps me. But
So what did you actually learn about yourself during therapy? And I have also a question about the same time range, which is how did your eating, fasting, and exercising look like during therapy? How was it evolving? And how did the therapy end? Was it like, oh, you're a healthy man now, you can go home? And or was there any end point to this?
so I think therapy taught me loads. I think it taught me that I had a real problem with not my sexuality, but with sex. And actually, one of the things that the eating disorder gave me was that it helped reduce my libido because I always thought wanting to have sex was bad, especially as a heterosexual man. I was like, if you want sex, you're a naughty person. And so we had to really talk through that. I also found out that actually a lot of this wasn't to do with food at all. That was just
Of course.
merely the outlet. I think it showed me that there were certain environments that kind of predisposed me to this. For example, my lovely parents grew up and they could still remember rationing after the world wars. So food to them equals love. So there was food around all of the time. And as I'd started to lose weight, it set up this binary that, you either eat or you don't. That was it. And it was easier to just not. And I think equally that showed me how binary my thinking was, that things were either good or bad, black or white, and that's not true in real life. So that's just a small snapshot of so many different things that it taught me.
Mm-hmm.
And to answer the question about how my eating was, I was really key that therapy should be fun. And as soon as I started to realize that, I started to treat it as like the gap year that I'd never had. So I started reintroducing foods into my diet slowly and steadily. And my diet was kind of quite boring at that point in time because I was trying to get more and more safe foods in. So each sort of week or month, I'd introduce something different. But
And
I
sorry,
also
let me ask you, was it coordinated by someone or you did it yourself?
I did it. I To be honest, they gave me the option of having a dietitian and
Mhm.
stuff. And I actually, to be honest, I was like, I don't really care. It's like people get snobby about what petrol they put in their car. At the end of the day, it makes it go. I don't care. So I started doing things like I'd have smoothies for breakfast. That was my first thing. And then I would work up and I would have something bigger for lunch and started
Mhm. And how
working like
stressful
that.
was it, like the making choices, making
You
food
know what?
choices? Was it stressful or not, or less and less?
It wasn't stressful, it was enjoyable. And I started to make it enjoyable because, like, for example, with making the smoothies, I started doing that when I felt more stable. So I started to associate food with being good, with food with being enjoyable rather than, oh, I've got to do this. It was kind of an enjoyable thing. So that was great. Um, and to answer the question about how therapy sort of petered out, and I
Hmm.
think that's what happened. I treated this like uh, a, I basically treated it like the gap year that I'd never had. So I mucked about. So sexually, I experimented quite a lot, which was a lot of fun. Socially, I experimented quite a lot and ended up flying to all these different places, doing different things. I started doing stuff outside of comedy. I started pushing myself outside of my comfort zone in order to try, but also fail. And I think I was always so scared of failure that I intentionally tried to seek out things that would make me fail in a manageable way.
Hmm.
And the therapy kind of all came to an end for two reasons, really, as difficult as it is to admit. The first one is my therapist was like, I actually don't think we're getting any further with therapy. And it
Okay.
was a lifeline. It was like swimming with
Mm,
those armbands. It was something that was a backup, but also without being too chintzy and horrible and reductive about it. I think I met my now partner,
sure.
and that was an incredible lifeline, and that sort of changed so many things. And I think one of the things underpinning the anorexia was loneliness,
Sure.
as and a wanting to find someone, and that was also kind of exacerbated a little bit by my mom. And actually, when I started to have fun in therapy, I just naturally found this amazing person that I want to spend the rest of my life with, and that gave me the kind of consistency that I suppose the eating disorder had previously. Um, so it did peter out, but I still think, and it's really natural in therapy, that people come out and then the real therapy starts. And I've
Absolutely.
actually probably learned more out of therapy than I possibly did in.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. We could easily expand here on like many different routes, but I understand we are pressured with time. And you have actually answered the last question I really wanted to ask to some extent, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more better, a little bit better. And the question is, because you mentioned that during your anorexic time, if I may say so, maybe it doesn't sound great, but you know what I mean, that it did give you a lot of sense of purpose you felt in the moment. And so my question is, what is the new sense of purpose in your life after recovery? Like, yeah, what is a
So many. Yeah, I think it's a great question, because I'm really keen to talk about recovery as, instead of talking about taking the eating disorder away, looking at giving something back. What do
absolutely.
you like? What do you enjoy? Who are you when you are mentally well? And for me, I think my best mental health version of me is when I'm silly, when I'm mucking about, when I'm making stupid jokes for nobody else's enjoyment other than my own. And so meeting my partner was a huge stabilizing effect. You know, managing to take that fear around food was great. Taking away that binary thinking of being a success or a failure, I think that really held me back for certain aspects. For example, my job as a comic, I would start to think you're a failure. You haven't done this, you're a failure. And that's not true. There are very few remits in life that are that binary. But actually using comedy as well was a huge stabilizing effect for me, and something that gave me this whole lifeline, this whole way of explaining stuff, this whole way of building my confidence. And that's why I'm so key that I started creating this comedy course specifically aimed at people with lived experience of all different types of eating disorder, in order to teach them stand-up comedy, to give them those words that I think are so lacking. I always say I use my body to show there was something wrong with my brain, and actually to try and use comedy in order to not only express yourself, but also draw other people towards you, to combat that loneliness, to build that attitude and condense an idea of identity. That has been really, really useful. So I've started to do that with this initiative called Comedy for Coping, and the website's comedyforcoping.com, in order to really draw everything from my experience, my therapy, and for other research that's been out there, to try and bring that into a one-stop shop place that places real world coping mechanisms in people's hands.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I want to really thank you. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you opening up during this conversation, but also in any other parts of the internet. I think it helps a lot of people, and I hope that even if at least one person benefits from our conversation, I feel absolutely blessed to be part of it. So thank you very much, and I wish you all the best in the future. And starting from today, I hope you'll have a great day.
Thank you, mate. And thank you for being so patient as well with time constraints and whatnot. Thanks for getting in touch, and thank you.
Thank you so much. All the best. Bye.